Hello everyone, this is Sam Arano, and today I'm going to look over my viewer survey, which I held over the course of this past May. This was my first viewer survey, and I wanted to get some data that I couldn't get from YouTube Analytics and really get a picture of my audience. First off, there were 1,651 respondents, which is only a very small percentage, less than 5% of my total subscribers. I have no idea to what degree that throws off the sample, but I guess we'll find out. First up, age. This is actually something I can compare against YouTube Analytics. On the left, you can see the graph of responses from the survey, and on the right are the results from YouTube Analytics. So it's pretty clear to me that respondents to the survey skewed younger, but overall, the typical viewer is close to my age, maybe a little younger. Next up is country of residence, which did line up very closely with YouTube Analytics, though this gave me a lot more detail. A lot of Israeli viewers are surprised to hear that the US makes up almost half of my viewership, while Israel is typically around 10%. Here it's 13%. After that, you have the major English-speaking countries and countries with large Jewish populations. And then you get Germany, Sweden, and Mexico. A lot more viewership from continental Europe, generally, than I expected. Moving on to the specific parts of Israel where my viewers there live, this is something that definitely couldn't have been provided by YouTube Analytics, and I'm thinking next year I'll do the same for some other big countries. On the left column is the population of each province as a percentage of Israel's overall population, and on the right is where they stand as a percentage of my viewers in the country. And something you'll notice right away is that I have disproportionate viewership in Tel Aviv, the center, and Jerusalem, despite the fact that you will see lots of comments proclaiming fandom from the north, the Galilee. Now, I think there are three phenomena behind this. First, the north and Haifa have a much larger Arab population, which isn't to say that I don't have Arab viewers in Israel. Some participated in this very survey, but there's obviously going to be less of an interest broadly. Second, the north and south of Israel are much poorer and tend to have a smaller proportion of English speakers. Obviously, Jerusalem is the poorest province of all. But I think this is mitigated by the fact that about a third of my viewers in Israel, and I glean this by cross-referencing it with the language question, are immigrants or university students coming in from abroad. And especially with English or Spanish speakers, they tend to establish themselves in the center of the country. Even outside of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, it'll be Ra'anana, Givat Shmuel, Modi'in, or Bet Shemesh, which are all in those areas. On that note, language. English obviously dominates, and even 60% right there. You'll notice that the number of native Hebrew speakers is actually quite a bit lower than the number of viewers in Israel, which follows on what I just said a moment ago. Spanish and Portuguese, again, you'll see these are widely spoken languages in places with large Jewish communities, Brazil, Argentina, Quebec as well for French. So I just want to say that while a few countries and a few languages do dominate, the number of places and languages that viewers are coming from really is staggering. It would have been easier to list the countries where there weren't any respondents. And with language, it got even weirder. One person wrote that their native language was Zulu, another Judeo-Tat, another Kashubian. I just want to single out the one respondent who listed their native language as Cornish. Cornish was extinct for a couple centuries, is actually being revived, and there are fewer than 1,000 fluent speakers. I believe the total number of native speakers, because there have only been native speakers again for a couple decades, could probably still be counted on one, maybe two hands. They did not exist when I was born, and one of them watches my video, if true. It's funny because in my last video on the UK, I showed that one of the outlying Jewish communities in the Georgian period was in Falmouth, which does not have a permanent synagogue anymore because the community is so small. So I'd be curious to know if that person is actually part of Cornwall's remnant Jewish community. So, gender. Yeah, this viewership is a total sausage fest. I knew that. This is a problem inherent to YouTube in general, even more so educational channels, and history probably most of all. I have noticed that I do attract more women viewers when I make videos specifically set in Western Europe. I have no idea why. as well as when I put a woman in the thumbnail. I don't do that as much as I'd like to because this is history. Women are often either marginalized from positions of historical influence or, when they aren't, written out entirely. And this is something I've talked about in some of my videos. But now, going into the 20th century, this is something we're going to start to see changing, much in the same way that the themes of class disparity within the Jewish community became more and more prevalent in my videos covering the 19th century. And while I didn't plan that, it's not a coincidence either. I don't have a lot to say about the demographics on sexuality specific to my channel. It just seems to reflect the broader distribution, at least in the developed world, where strictly open homosexuality has been pretty static for my lifetime, but bisexuality has become more and more open with each successive generation, in a very consistent and dramatic way. I would be curious to see what it looked like 40 years ago. Obviously, YouTube didn't exist back then, but there was an interesting trend back in the bad old days, at least in the US, and I'd suspect other English-speaking countries as well, and probably Israel too, when Jews were much more likely to be openly gay, and I mean way more openly gay, than the general population. We're talking even back to the 1930s and 40s. This is actually something I've been curious to investigate further. It's certainly notable that many leading gay rights advocates early on, at least in the US, were Jewish. And unfortunately, it's fueled a lot of intersections between anti-Semitism and homophobia. I certainly have my own hypotheses about why this was the case, and I wouldn't really know how to go about researching that, but it's something I'd like to do. So, education. Now, I come from a country where fewer than 1/3 of adults have any kind of university degree. So in a poll that is much more skewed towards younger people, it's astonishing that the majority of you have a bachelor's degree, and that a fifth have a postgraduate degree. I don't even have a postgraduate degree. So, congratulations. Now, most of you have no military experience, which is unsurprising, but I do know someone in the IDF has been using my videos as part of some kind of history program, which I have mixed feelings about because I am a film major, not a history major. And lo and behold, the vast majority of my current and former military were in Israel, and almost everyone currently serving is in Israel. Okay, so religion. This is where things get really interesting. I suspected that most of my viewers weren't religiously observant, so I specified in the question that they should say whatever nominal affiliation they have or ever had, and a majority of my viewers aren't Jewish. Now, this may sound strange to some of you, but I look at that and conclude that this channel has been a success, because I wanted to make Jewish history accessible in the way that other histories were, to a general audience. And clearly many of you feel the same way, because I get comments all the time saying, I was fascinated by this even though I'm not Jewish, and not once have I seen a comment on, like, Linfamy saying, I was fascinated by this even though I'm not Japanese. He's not even Japanese. Well, those people are in fact the majority, so mission accomplished. I was, however, surprised to see that among Jews, secular Jews are not the majority. For context, here in Israel, only a little under 1/3 of Jews are religiously observant, and that's actually a figure that's gone up over the past century. It used to be a lot lower. Reform, conservative, Reconstructionist essentially don't exist here. And in the US, which has the second largest Jewish population, it's my experience that most Jews are non-practicing beyond celebrating the holidays, which everybody does. Even people who are maybe members of a Reformed synagogue only go a few times a year during major events. You know, that's Minhag America in a nutshell. Something else I found weird about this statistic is that conservative Jews outnumbered both Reform and Modern Orthodox, when in truth it's the smallest of the three main Maskilic factions by far, and is often said to be nearing extinction. I know the majority of Jews in Sweden are conservative Jews, but that's a complete anomaly. Among Gentiles, 28.3% said you have no personal experience with Judaism or Jewish culture, which I don't know if that's way more than I expected or way less. 61% said they know a Jewish person personally, but the 46.6% who say they visited a synagogue, Jewish museum, or Jewish historic site is genuinely a lot more than I expected. Okay, so political ideology. I was trying to be as broad as possible, and it's funny that the majority of respondents weren't Jewish because this isn't that far off from a pretty accurate representation of political ideology among American Jews. Unsurprisingly, the responses were dominated by the century-plus rivalry between the Democratic Socialists and Social Democrats, which is funny because it doesn't exactly line up with my next question, which was, if you were able to vote in the next Israeli general election, and the parties running were the same as those currently in the Knesset, which party would you be most likely to support? Now, a slim majority of you said, I don't know. And I respect your honesty. But I did something a little different for this, and instead of just summarizing the entire table of parties that people chose, I basically simulated the results of an Israeli election in which you were the electorate, and looked at what the distribution of power in the Knesset would be based on the actual election rules like the minimum threshold of 3.25%. And based on that, only 8 parties would make it in, and it would be totally dominated by left-wing parties. Like, all of the parties on this chart that are actually part of the outgoing coalition have almost a 3/4 majority in this scenario. You could form a government with just Labor, Meretz, and Blue and White. If not for the fact that there are only 8 parties, this looks like an Israeli election from the 1950s. Which, again, I would say is a pretty accurate representation of the political spectrum among American Jews. Why it ended up that way, despite most of my audience not being American and not being Jewish, I have no idea. The reason I say this doesn't quite line up with the responses to the previous question is because in that question, the Democratic Socialist contingent was the largest and Social Democrats were the second largest, whereas in this question, it's reversed. Dramatically so if you include Blue and White as a Social Democratic Party, which I personally would, though they like to avoid the label. And with that over, we're on to boilerplate YouTube administrivia. A slim majority of you found my videos in 2021, which makes perfect sense. Honestly, I'm surprised it's not more because that's when the channel really blew up. 1.3% of you knew me or my work prior to YouTube. I assume those are all people who just know me personally, and 1.6% said you weren't sure. Again, I respect your honesty. Most of you didn't know I have 2 other channels, which is fair because not only are they very different, but with this channel being a full-time job, I don't really have time to work on them ever. And as a result, one of them, Elections Israel, is now fully defunct. Most of you watch other channels connected to Jewish history, but there's no particular consensus on which is the favorite. Now, the last 3 questions, I'm not going to talk about those. Those answers are just for me, because if I release those responses publicly, it'll create an expectation that I'm going to cover those areas and those topics, and that's not how I work. I don't create expectations, and I don't talk about my plans because plans change. Sometimes I won't be able to do a certain video. My approach is constantly changing, ideas evolve. It's not a good idea. But I will say, and this is a total coincidence, the most popular pick for a country-based special was Ethiopia, which is the one I ended up doing. And that was my viewer survey for 2022. I now have a much better picture of my audience that I think will be really helpful. Maybe it's helpful to you too, for reasons I don't know. I hope to do this again, and have a nice 2023.